Tutorial is going to cover several different ways of using what are called masks in Photoshop. The first thing is going to be clipping masks. So inside of the clipping masks folder, you see several different images with several different examples. The first thing that we're going to use to do is this here. So as you can see, we have the text called just flowers, and that is on a white background. And instead of the text being just a solid color, it actually has the image of the flowers showing through it. This is not that hard to do, as you'll see here in a second. So I'm going to open the flowers image in Photoshop. First of all, this image has watermarks, as you could see up here. The other tutorials explain the spot healing brush, which is probably something that I could use up here to get rid of some of this stuff. Pretty cool. So again, just kind of getting rid of some of this. Not that we necessarily have to do that for this tutorial, but again, real quickly, you can now see that whatever those watermarks are pretty much gone or a lot less noticeable. So what we're going to do is look at the type tool. And the type tool basically allows you to use text. And you can either kind of click and drag a box over your image and start typing that way, just kind of, like you can do in, let's say, PowerPoint, or you could just click once and start to type. I'm just going to click one time. And actually, when I click in Photoshop, it automatically pastes lorem ipsum text. It's just sort of generic text. And you basically are going to have to retype it to see, what it's going to really say and to change your font and everything. So I'm just going to hit delete, and then I'm just going to type flowers, all in capital letters. Very, very hard to see, right? Like, what the heck is going on? It's pretty small text. Not really a great font for this. So after I type it, I'm going to select the entire word, all of the text. And then I'm going to come up here and make it larger. So here's a 72-point font. Here's all these different sizes here. What if you want to get in between these sizes? Like, you can only go down to 6 points and you can only go up to 72? No. Technically, you could click inside of here and enter whatever size you want. So I could put 100 and I can just hit return. Now I have a 100 point font. I could also do this. I have my text selected, and I'm going to click and drag over the size of the font. Now I'm just using my mouse wheel to scroll up and down. If you don't have a mouse wheel, you can't do this. But basically, I can scroll down just a little bit. I can scroll up and increase the size. Kind of interesting. For this to work, though, we need a really thick font. Like this little tiny little thin font, you're barely going to see the flowers through it. So I'm going to find something that's just kind of big and chunky, like maybe Arial, and maybe like Arial Bold. That's not too bad. I'm going to move it over here. It's a little bit maybe too big here. So I'm going to select it and just make it a slightly smaller. And there we go. Again, that's not even as thick of a font as I could find. I'm sure I could come in here and find some. Here's Arial Black, actually. That looks a little bit better to me. And let me just kind of make that a little bit smaller. Okay, so and then you can just hit the check mark when you're done. Now we have our text. It's just black. That's just the default color for text. It doesn't really matter what this color is. If you want to change it, you could just double click on your text layer. As long as you have the type layer selected, you can just double click on it to select it, and then you could come up here and click on that color and make it whatever color you want. White, black, doesn't really matter. Or any color you want. But here's the thing. This is kind of boring. It's like, flowers, yeah, pretty horizontal, kind of boring, not super interesting. How do we make it slightly more dynamic? Well, if you have your text layer selected and you have the type tool selected, you can do what's called a warp text. And basically by clicking on the warp, it allows you to sort of choose one of 15 different styles of a warp. So we have all these kind of different things, and all have different parameters that you can switch in here. I usually, for the example, I used an arch with a bend like this, something like this. I don't know exactly what the parameters were, but to me that looks a little bit more dynamic than just the plain flat text moving straight across. Now, I'm just going to click OK, and now we have our layer called flowers. Also notice your text layers, when you commit them by hitting the check mark, it renames your layers exactly what the text is. So there's really no reason to have to rename your text layers. They're exactly what they say. Pretty straightforward. If you happen to need to go back and modify a text layer, you'll have to make sure, again, the text tool is selected, or the type tool. You have to make sure your text layer is selected. You can click anywhere inside, and now you're back to editing again. Speaking of which, if you spell something wrong in Photoshop or Illustrator, it does not warn you like other programs. There is no red squiggly line here that's saying, hey, you spelled something wrong. It will absolutely let you spell something wrong. However, there is a spell check. It's just you have to do it manually. And so if you're ever using text in your Photoshop or Illustrator files, in Illustrator, you'll have to use text, but if you ever use text in Photoshop as well, you just have to go to Edit, Check Spelling. And what it's going to do is it's going to analyze all layers of your document, and it's going to say, hey, flowers with 2 R's is not in the dictionary. What do you want to change it to? What it's giving me as the suggestion is also not what I want. Here is the actual suggestion, and I'm just going to click change. If you click done, it will not change your text. If you click ignore, it also isn't going to change it. It'll go on to the next word that it thinks. If you click ignore all, it's going to ignore this mistake and any other mistake that's exactly the same. So basically, you click ignore if it's like something that is supposed to be spelled that way, it just doesn't happen to be in the dictionary. Otherwise, I'm just going to click change, spell check complete. Good. Back to the way it was. So to do the masking is actually pretty easy, but what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to have the flowers on their own layer. So they already are. They're on the background here, but that layer that has the flowers needs to be above our text. We cannot drag layers that are locked above other layers. If they're locked in place, that's exactly why they're locked, so they can't be moved or like altered in many different ways. So what I'm going to do is just click on the little lock. And that unlocks that layer and allows you to move it around, like so. Now it can be above the other layer. So I'm just going to rename this new layer flowers. Yes, I have two layers named flowers. However, it's very clear that one is an image and one is text. With this new layer on top of our other layer, it's kind of weird that it's blocking that other layer. Just the way it is right now. We're going to just right-click on the image layer, and we're going to do what's called a create a clipping mask. What that does is it allows the layer that's on top to show through the shape of the layer underneath. So the flowers layer that's actually the image of the flowers is showing through the text. That is called flowers. And if I get my move tool, you can see I can move that flowers layer around in between, even to the point where it goes off the page, which we don't want. But it basically allows you to put that layer wherever you want it to go. Now, this looks a little weird because it has this transparent background. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a new layer. I'm going to move that layer to the bottom. And I'm just going to call it background because that makes sense. I'm just going to fill it in with white. Oops. I'm having a hard time with my keyboard today. I'm just going to fill it in with white. So I'm going to make sure white is my foreground color here. Get my paint bucket and fill that in. Exactly, if you haven't seen this before, this is in the tutorial of the hand that kind of morphs a smaller hand coming out of the thumb and then another smaller hand coming out of that thumb. Basically, the paint bucket tool is going to allow you to, with one click, fill a layer in with another color. And as long as white is your foreground color here, which if it's not, there's lots of different ways to do it. One is you could just double click on your foreground layer or foreground color and just go up into the top left corner, and that's white right there. What I did is I actually had, I had white as my background, and I had a different color, let's say, as my foreground. And what I did is I just did the switcheroo. This little button here will switch your background and foreground colors. This little icon will return your foreground and background back to the default colors of black as your foreground and white as your background. And then you can switch them from there as well. Anyway, I accidentally undid that, so I'm just going to fill that back in. But in the example, I also have a little bit more of an enhancement around the outer edge. And this is called a stroke. This is just a black line that goes around the outer edge of a layer. This happens, I'm going to do it on the text layer, but you could do this with any kind of layer, even if it's an image. This is going to be the same kind of workflow as the drop shadow that is in the hand tutorial video as well. And down at the bottom here, with the flowers, the text layer selected, I'm going to click the FX button, and I'm going to add a stroke. Now, stroke doesn't allow you very many options. You can choose the size of the stroke. Like, how thick do you want it to be? You can choose whether you want it to be positioned inside of the layer, outside of the layer, or centered. I want it to be outside, probably for this. And then you can change the opacity and the color of it as well. I want it to be 100% opacity in black. So now here we go. And so now we have basically our text with a nice stroke around it, so it's really standing out from the background. And now we're seeing the flowers through the text. Just like the drop shadow or any other effects that you add, if you need to change the effect, like if I want to change the way the stroke looks, I could double click on the word stroke here and modify it from there. We can turn the effects off and turn them back on again, and so on. Now, that's about it. The only thing that I would do if I was going to continue to work on this, if this was part of a larger image is I would probably want to link these two layers together because they have to always stay in this order. If the flowers image layer is somehow moved above a different layer later, it's going to break that clipping mask, and you'll have to kind of move the layers back and redo it. But if you select both layers and then right-click and link them, that's never going to be an issue. They're always going to be kind of glued together. If you move one, it's going to move the other. If you move them up or down in your layers palette, it's also going to move the other. Now, notice I spelled background wrong, so I have to change it. Anyway, that's how you do a really basic clipping mask with text. This can be used in a slightly different capacity to create something like this. So with this example, I have, in this example, I have this sort of dancer here, and then I have a woman on on a beach showing through, and they're both kind of showing through at the same time. But again, the woman on the beach is only showing through the shape of the other dancer. It's going to be very close to the same workflow. So let's open both of these images in Photoshop. So both the figure and the sunset. I'm going to drag those and let them open in Photoshop. They're going to open in separate tabs. So here's my figure, here's my sunset. Doesn't matter what order we do this in, but I'm going to select all, Command A or Control A. I want this entire image to be selected. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to come back here and paste it. Done this many, many, many times before. Zoom in here. I'm going to name this new layer Sunset. Turn it off temporarily, and then go back to the background. So just like the text was in the last example was floating in its own on its own layer, we need to have this figure floating on its own layer as well. So once again, I'm going to come back to the object selection tool and select subject. Let's see if that works. Is it going to get the figure while leaving behind the white space, the negative space here and here? I don't know. We'll see how it looks. It does a pretty good job. It didn't necessarily work on this little chunk in here, but I could probably zoom in. And again, this is going to look a little pixelated when we zoom in. But I could come in here with my quick select tool with a very small size brush and holding Option, I could color out that little area so that is deselecting that area. It's probably not going to really matter for this entire, for this particular image. But I'm just going to cut it, and I'm going to paste it. Notice when I cut it, it actually filled the background with black. That was because I had my background color as black. So actually, before I do that, I'm going to switch my background and foreground color so that it's white. That way, when I cut, it's going to leave a white background. Yeah, there's going to be a little bit of a silhouette there. But because this figure is going to be going right back to where it was, it's not going to really matter that there's a little bit of a line there. And again, if you can't really, I'm having a hard time getting this exactly where I want it. So sometimes you have to zoom in, and basically now I can get it perfectly lined up. Now we're going to turn this layer back on. Just like in the previous example, we had the photo of the flowers above the text of the flowers because we wanted the photo of the flowers to show through the shape of the text. The same thing has to happen here. The sunset needs to be on top. The figure needs to be underneath. We're going to right click on the sunset layer, and we're going to create a clipping mask, and boom. Now, this is looking pretty cool the way it is. However, if we want to show a little bit of the bottom figure layer through the sunset, we just have to reduce the opacity a little bit. And that's how I achieved that in the example I just showed. So again, we're basically masking one layer to another. We can get the move tool. We can put this wherever we want. Have that sunset wherever you want it to be. It could even be off the screen. I don't know. I kind of like it around here. I don't know. It's kind of interesting little spot there. And then you can change the opacity to have it show a little bit, to have it show a lot, or to have it, show nothing but that top layer through the layer that's underneath. So again, a very cool effect. It can be achieved very quickly with clipping masks. Are there other ways you could do this in Photoshop? I could think of about 5 other ways to achieve this exact result, right? I could make this happen many ways. Some of you might be like, yeah, I could think of a couple ways too. You could have erased around the outer edge of this sunset layer or whatever. Like, we could have done a lot of things without doing a clipping mask, but they're far more time consuming, far more destructive, and don't allow you to do things like this, like move this stuff around and do whatever you want, and to change the opacity of these things to get the results that you want. It just this is a far better way of accomplishing that goal.